Welcome to another episode of the Indian Silicon Valley podcast. For today's show, I have Mr. Dhrupad Karwa with me. He's the founder of HaikuJAM and INSPO, and we're going to talk all about creativity, inspiration, and a lot about how to go about product expansion today. Today's episode is also very special because he's not just an admirational figure for me. He's somebody that I've been inspired from for the last couple of years, in fact, because I first saw him at an inspirational keynote session where he told me all about his journey from where he started off at 15. But without further ado, I'd like to welcome Mr. Dhrupad Karwa on the show. Thank you so much, Dhrupad, for joining me. It's such an honor for me to be able to host you.
Thank you so much, Jivraj. It's been a long time. We've been trying to do this for a while, so
Yeah.
so glad we got a chance to chat.
For sure, for sure. Like it's definitely being a long while, but I'm sure this is going to be worth it. Before we, let's say go a bit about your journey, go about Inspo and Haiku Jam, I'd love to let's say address a very abstract yet relevant question, right? So something that I really found fascinating about your journey is that you've had that entrepreneurial bug, as they call it, right, from the very start, and it's been very evident, right? But not exactly that, but there's this concept of 10% entrepreneur, right? And hustling is very common when we associate it with, let's say, entrepreneurship, founders, and founders are always hustling. But I have kind of my own opinions about it. But I'd love if you can perhaps, like, as a youngster who's been in the ecosystem for a while now, what are your opinions on the concept of hustling, side projects, 10% entrepreneur, and all of those things? And what would your mind space be about those things before we dive into, let's say, the more serious stuff?
Good question. So I wouldn't say I have that many opinions on the topic.
All
For
right.
me, it's really simple. Like I think people should do things that they enjoy and
Mhm.
they care about, right? And that might sound like a little bit drab or super obvious, but I think it's one of those um, simple but really overlooked truths that if people simply just do what they care about, it sounds a little cheesy, but the world would actually just be better, right? If we all just like looked within and understood who we are. Because I think whether you call it a side hustle or a business or a piece of art or a song, like whatever it is that you're doing, ultimately it's an expression of who you are, right? And any kind of creative work, it's an inquiry into yourself. So I think if you do that, you're good, right? Now, whether you choose to, let's say, do it in the context of a startup or a blog or anything, I think that's more like tactical, right? That's just a decision of the kind of delivery mechanism for the value and for your gift and for your expression. And all of that can be figured out, but I think people get too caught up sometimes in the frenzy of Twitter and almost like the pressure to do something. And this person is investing in Bitcoin. This person is doing this. This person is doing this, and you feel that everyone is like succeeding except you, and you should really be doing something. And I think it's okay. You should really just be yourself and do what you really enjoy, whatever that is, whether it's a company or something else.
For sure. I mean, like, again, I think wonderful pointers mentioned there. I'm not sure how much of it we're able to, internalize, because I'm not sure how many people actually do things because or as a form of expression of themselves. But I think the more we do, the more we can express and the more we can explore, I think. So wonderful thoughts there. And I think this is a great way to start the episode. But, let's say turning from there and going a bit into your journey beyond the, let's say, conventional introduction to your journey, I'd love if you can perhaps club it with how you've looked at time investment or taking up different projects over the years, right? Because what I want to understand here is that I'm sure at any given point you have had multiple options, if not at the start, especially, having had some amount of experience. So how do you go about, let's say, deciding and doubling down on something that you have conviction in and then take it forward from there? So if you can club that with, let's say, your introduction and how you've evolved over the years from, starting that newspaper at the age of 14 to a jute business to the hackathon to Haiku Jam to Inspo, it'd be lovely to get, let's say, an overview of that with a segue into what I mentioned.
Wow, that's a really big question. So something I probably need to think about.
For sure.
Um, I'd say for me personally, um, it's always been a relatively easy decision-making process because I'm quite binary in certain decisions,
Okay.
right? So the I'm extremely excited about something or I'm not, right?
Right.
And there's very, very little in between for me personally, and that's beyond startups. If I look back at like my childhood and high school and university, that same behavior manifested in a bunch of different ways, right? Like, so for instance, like lessons that and subjects that I loved, I'd really, really engage in. For things that were just for a grade or an exam, I'd really struggle to like motivate myself to turn up, right? And that isn't necessarily the right approach. It's a very personal approach, and I feel that a balance is always required because there's a bunch of things, in company building that you won't necessarily enjoy, but need to be done.
Right.
So for me, it's been a case of like figuring out something that I really care about, right? And I'm super excited by. And it's honestly like really intuitive. Of course, there's a bunch of work that needs to be done, right? Like actually speaking to customers, understanding the broader market opportunity, um, and assuming all of that in place, more importantly, I need to really be excited about it. And it's difficult to define excitement. It's almost like a really like a biochemical reaction, right? Like you can
Yeah,
feel it in your blood,
for
right?
sure.
If something like making you feel like sparkly and enthusiastic and something that you're ready to get up at dawn and work on, then that's basically the idea. And of course, in the past, I've done things that like I didn't necessarily super enjoy. And one of the reasons I feel was those projects were not necessarily as impactful or meaningful or successful was because of that reason. Like I was doing it for uh, perhaps the wrong reasons, or just I personally just wasn't aligned enough with those ideas. So I can't even remember the question you asked, but hopefully that answered it in some rambly way.
No, I get that. Like, again, like one of those simple things which, if we intuitively followed, life would get better. But very important to reiterate these simple things, because I think much of it needs to be followed than just preached, right? And you are a personification of it. So I think that's my takeaway there. Let's say moving. Sure.
Maybe just one thing to add there is that I feel it's also it's not just like feel good advice or things that I tell myself. It's actually super pragmatic as well. Like I feel that if you don't care, right, it becomes really difficult to persevere,
Right.
right? I personally found this, like, if you just don't care enough, inevitably there's going to be a lot of roadblocks, right? There's going to be a lot of challenges along the way. Very few people go from 0 to 1 or 0 to success in a very short amount of time.
Mhm.
And I find that in those moments of like, challenge and trials and tribulations and all the rest of it, that's when you need a lot of intrinsic motivation. And I personally find that really hard to summon unless I'm super invested in whatever it is. So I think it has a lot of like practical benefits and implications as well.
For sure, for sure. I think, like, again, especially in entrepreneurship or being a founder, like if you're truly not, if your heart is not there, if you don't care enough, you wouldn't succeed or persevere, as you mentioned. So beautiful cue out there. And I think that's a good way to enter into, let's say, the story of Haiku Jam and perhaps Inspo as well, right? And again, I wouldn't like, one thing that I don't especially like are the generic questions. So I'll try, clubbing it with another, perhaps different thought. But one thing which is very different about Haiku Gem, at least according to me, is that in an age of technology where everybody's connecting with each other through mediums in terms of social media, you clubbed it with, let's say, a factor of creativity which was really unique in its own way, and category creating, right? So let's talk about Haiku Jam a bit, about in terms of category creation and how much of it is a struggle, especially because you're venturing in a space which is, let's say, uncharted, right? There is so much uncertainty, if not doubt, and there's so many variables which aren't defined, right, that you only find throughout your course. So if you can perhaps give us an insight as to how it was post starting up Haiku Jam, what was the market reaction like, what were you thinking as a founder, what was your belief in the product, like what was the early adopter saying about the product, things like that. That'd be a great way to understand how you started Haiku Jam, and a great cue for all early founders out there.
Sure thing. So I think with Haiku Jam, honestly, I think I wish I was thinking more as a founder when I'd actually launched it, when rather we launched it, because we made, I think, every mistake in the book, but learned a lot from those mistakes as well. So you can't really regret them. I think when it comes to, category creation and strategy, and the medium that we chose, um, generally, I think with a lot of creative ideas, or any you know uh, good products, there's a temptation to post rationalize, right? Like, it's easy to look back and thread
Right.
together like a really, really elegant narrative, and almost like position it like it was some grand plan, right? And all the dots just connected, and the dominoes fell. And life is like almost never like that. And that was definitely the case with HaikuJAM. It started as an idea in a tea shop, right? From a genuine space of like vulnerability, right? I'd been working on something completely different, in the energy sector in the UK, that had failed within a summer. Like, it didn't last long. We'd moved incredibly quickly, but we weren't able to get some regulatory approvals from the energy regulator and the government. So the project was literally like made redundant within the space of a weekend. And being a founder, this is like the worst thing that can happen to you, right? Like, you just feel really low. And yeah, I was in a tea shop with my best friend, took out a notebook, and we started like writing haiku together, and random little scribbles and doodles, and like micro stories. And it was just, again, there was no agenda here at all. The last thing I was actually thinking of is that I want to build something, I want a new idea. It was just really cathartic, right? I still don't really know what I was thinking on that day, but just took out a notebook, wrote a line of something, and I thought, hey, it'd be really interesting if Shubham, my best friend, continues this, because I just wanted to get out of my own head at that point. I really wasn't like feeling good. I wasn't satiated at all with my own thinking or my own emotions, and I thought it'd be interesting just to see like where he takes this, right? And yeah, it was fun. It was just really fun. It was an emotionally insightful experience. We were there for like a couple of hours, just like writing together in silence over tea. And then and then just had this urge that wouldn't it be amazing to connect with strangers around the world, and the context of the connection is creativity and something a little bit more meaningful. And I think this is where like maybe you can post rationalize, or it's just a case of like different interests and thoughts coalescing, coming together. But at the time, I was feeling like pretty disillusioned with social media generally, right?
Mhm.
Always had a bit of a complex relationship with it. I just like, you have a bunch of these friends or followers on social platforms, and yet like maybe two of them well, and then everyone else is just like, yeah, you just don't know them very well, and they
Mhm.
seem to be projecting a side of themselves that doesn't seem particularly genuine, even though they're very likely genuine people. But the medium is just not like a lens into who they truly are, or a lens into their subconscious selves. And then, yeah, I felt it would be really interesting to build a product that connected people in a slightly more meaningful way. Um, and that was the beginning, right? So there was no real thought of like, who is the customer, right? Who is the what's the market? Where is the market? What's the monetization model? At least not initially. It was
Mhm.
just a case of, this feels like a beautiful idea. It's something that I would use, right? And my close friends would use. And why don't we start there? And sometimes I think it's as simple as that, right? Like, if it's likely that if you really, really love it and like it, there's probably a few more people who will as well, and then you can go from there. So, yeah, we launched it in the UK. Things were quite slow, and it just very, very small community forming around it. But then what was super interesting was that there was a bunch of growth happening in India, in pockets of Southeast Asia, and one thing led to another, and we were really excited about this. We couldn't ignore it anymore, and we took a flight, moved to India, and we've been building, there ever since, since 2017. So of course a lot of things happened along the way, but it was just a case of, a lot of there was a lot of community love coming from Asia, and
Right.
we thought, instead of trying to understand that from a dashboard sitting on the other side of the world, why don't we just, you know uh, take a flight, be on the ground, and meet with these people in person. And we didn't do anything like, user research or like focus groups. All that stuff is a little bit like it. I don't know how useful it actually is. I mean, to some degree, but instead we just hung out with people, right? We hosted like haiku jam sessions in probably thousands of cafes and venues around the world at this point. And it was clear that the experience had just culturally resonated. And yeah, we just took it from there. So.
No, no, that's pretty interesting. I mean, again, like I see a series, a pattern developing, right? That you don't have to complicate things by looking too much or reading too much into it. Just has to go with the flow sometimes. And if it's right, it feels right, then you have to keep doing the right things, and the other things kind of follow. So I think this would be a great way. So I have like two questions in my mind, but I'll keep the other one for later. And I think this would be a great way to enter into inspo, right? And get a bit of insight there as well, and that too again clubbed, if not like not to clutter a lot of things. However, understand a bit of product expansion. Like I think like many things have been said about this in terms of, it has to be feedback driven, iterative, people are going to tell you what to do, and all of that I get in principle. However, as a founder, if you can perhaps give us practical insights to how things were progressing with haiku jam, like what were people telling you, how were you iterating on that basis, and how did you eventually stumble upon inspo, right? Like what was the inception of inspo, and how do you essentially perhaps manage two projects, or if this is a segue from haiku jam itself, how do you go about managing it? So let's address this for the next 5 minutes, and it'd be lovely to understand more about inspo, because I feel it's a truly, again, category creating product, very very different, unique, creative, and it's going to be very useful when it does launch, and I'm sure it's going to launch soon. So yeah, leaving the floor to you now.
Sure thing. So maybe we can start with. I'll just speak a little bit about what
For
Inspo
sure.
actually, then we can talk about the inception of it. So in one line, Inspo, it's your AI inspiration partner, right? And it's there to help enrich your creative thinking around anything that you may be working on, whether it's social media campaigns, content, pitching, planning, any kind of creative work. Inspo is there to help uh, be that inspiration partner and provide you with a almost an infinite stream of curated, personalized, intelligent inspiration. So we never want your inspiration tank to run out. It should always be full. That's something we really truly believe in philosophically. So if we were just to like take a step back and talk about how it started, so everything was an illusion of an evolution of Haiku Jam itself. So Haiku Jam was at a point where we'd crossed over 1 million creators from around the world. Like over 100 million lines had been published, and every second there was like 2-3 lines published around lots and lots of different topics in the app. And things were really really exciting. At the same time, like every startup has its challenges, and we seem to have this almost interesting growth challenge where the product was not necessarily exploding, let's say like a TikTok or something like that. And yet it was really meaningful and had this crazy, crazy deep engagement and community love around it, right?
Right.
And we had to figure out what's next, because of course, like, we're not building just a free product, or it's not a charity either. Like, we need to find a sustainable business model.
For sure.
um, and we didn't really want to do things like ads. Just didn't really sit right with us. We explored and tested microtransactions, subscriptions, and those were great. But again, this was where I think we were extremely strategic and tactical. Like, we did a bunch of modeling and realized that this is going to be a challenge, right? It's going to be a challenge to really, really scale this. And at the same time, we were always curious about what was actually happening inside of HaikuJam, right? Beyond the product, we were really, really curious about the content that was being created and the entire corpus. Because on the surface, it looks like people are, writing collaborative poems. Um, but what's really happening is that people, are deeply, deeply expressing themselves, right?
Right.
And the entire corpus of content of writing, it's like a dynamic repository of human expression, about anything. That was key. It wasn't just about traditionally poetic topics like, romance and waterfalls and love and things like that. It was about anything. Literally, your morning coffee, what a politician said, an IPL match happening, a creative take on that. Um, and we realized that we really need to understand this better, right? Because just almost as like that's almost like a product responsibility. We need to understand it better so that we can help personalize the product better. And then we also had this kind of side hypothesis that the corpus contains a lot of creative ideas and insights, right? That could be useful in a host of different contexts. It could be creative marketing, mental health, wellness. There was a bunch of research that came out of Sweden about HaikuJAM and how it boosts well-being, and the associations in HaikuJAM are really, really useful in a bunch of different contexts. So we said, okay, look, it's worth exploring this, right? Because again, I think teams should always, you know, always figure out like what are their natural strengths and what are they super good at as well. And like I said, HaikuJAM, our strength didn't really seem to grow a product like TikTok, right? We never really cracked the consumption model. It kept hitting like sort of growth ceilings, but it seemed that we were really good at unlocking people's creativity, right? Like 70% of active users were always publishing content and writing about all sorts of different topics, and there was a really, really high, um, you know, conversion metrics, especially considering most chat apps have that kind of conversion to chat, right? So we said, look, we seem to be good at unlocking people's creativity. We seem to be good at bringing people together, and we've built this community, and there's this really interesting corpus. Why don't we now start investing more in data science to actually learn more about that corpus? And we will take that leap of faith that these learnings will be fundamentally useful, right? These learnings will take us to the next stage, and help us into the next chapter, whatever that may be. So that's pretty much what we did. We invested a lot more to understand. Before building any kind of product like Inspo, we ran a ton of experiments. So it wasn't just like, a gung ho approach. We were pretty systematic. So for instance, like one of the first things that we did was we partnered with a bunch of brands and agencies, where they would essentially give us a topic of interest, and then we would mine the content for that topic and produce a really interesting like creative insights report for them, right? So one of the first big customers was Baskin Robbins, and they reached out wanting to understand like what does happiness mean today, right, to Indian millennials, and also what does ice cream mean.
Mm.
So within like a few hours, we realized that there were like hundreds of thousands of lines, right, of expression around these two topics. We analyzed them and we curated a report. And yeah, they were blown away by some of the findings in that
Yeah.
report. And like one of the examples was they found that um, Netflix was the most associated brand with ice cream in all of the jams and poems about ice cream. And this was like at the end of 2018 and not something that people had expected at all, right? In fact, the brand didn't even believe us to begin with. They said, how is that possible? It must be an ice cream brand, right? Like the number one association. But it wasn't. And since then, both Baskin Robbins and Ben and Jerry's in the US have gone on to launch a range of really interesting partnerships with Netflix. I think Ben and Jerry's literally launched a brand new flavor called Netflix and Chilled, which was a range of vegan ice creams.
Yeah.
They've done a bunch of content partnerships, and it got them thinking really, really differently about their category and the possibilities within their category. So that was just one of like a bunch of insights that they got. We made a number of other reports for brands around the world, and just by the reaction to those reports and those presentations, and we gained a lot of conviction that wow, this really is a very unique corpus, and it feels as though we could systematically almost like unearth inspiration for creative thinkers around the world. And that led to Inspo. So Inspo was born on top of HaikuJAM, where it would literally analyze the content and the expression in HaikuJAM and synthesize it into actionable inspiration. And that was the very first version in private beta. And since then, it's now feeding off a bunch of different content sources and associations from around the web, and new properties that we're also building out as well, which we which we yeah, still very early, haven't launched them yet. So exciting things to come.
For sure.
So yeah, a combination of like making mistakes, serendipity, right place, right time, and also again just aligning with our own principles about who we are, right? Because I feel HaikuJAM was at a point where we could take it in so many different directions. And a number of them made sense. It wasn't like there was only one path. There were a number of different paths to build that business, and we had to figure out the path that, one, we felt as an opportunity, but two, and even more importantly, that we're super excited about it. Like, this is, you know, we'd be proud to build this product and share it with the world. So yeah, that's pretty much kind of a quick journey on how we got here.
Wow, that's again, I feel very insightful to understand, because I'm not very sure if this is the right way to put it, but the way I look at it, like, so much thought went behind actually utilizing the product in the right manner and actually thinking of it beyond the scope of usage, right? So you could have
Right.
either relied on, let's say, just the jams that were coming in and done something about it, but the fact that you thought about it further, the team, dug deeper into what the use cases of the platform could be, is a very important factor, I think, because it's very easy to, I guess, get carried away with what you're currently doing, and let's say double down on that and keep doing that again and again, which is a great process and great pathway as well. But what you've done shows a very fresh approach to how you can approach your own product. So great cue out there, Drupad. And I want to take another moment here and probably ask you that, you've been, if I'm not wrong again here, you were you were born in India, but you were brought up in the UK, and you did a bunch of projects there. But you then, came back to India, and you're building from India for the world, essentially, right? HaikuJAM's not essentially an Indian product per se, although it might have received traction there. But with Inspo as well, I'm sure the idea is to go global and, build for multiple other countries. So I'd love to perhaps like give understand a personal insight to why did you choose India, and how has your experience been in terms of a product first approach as well? Like, what's the response been? How's it been for the team to create from India, build from India, especially now, like post COVID as well? Like, although we're not past it, what's your experience been through COVID in a flattened world, and what was it before that? So would love to understand that.
So I think it was HaikuJAM that brought us to India, right? Like I said at the earlier in the chat, there wasn't like some big strategy meeting that happened where we were picking markets. Like, this just happened. And I still don't really know what the trigger was. Maybe someone picked it up on the App Store one day and started jamming and loved it and shared it with their friends. And suddenly, journalists and Jaipur Literature Festival and all were reaching out. We don't really know what was the tipping point, but that's what happened. Um, and at the time, it felt like the right thing to do, right?
Mhm.
We were raising like a seed round and getting rejected from pretty much everywhere in the UK and the US. Like, we didn't have a really big network or anything, but we knew of a few folks. We'd been in the ecosystem. And people found it like a really curious, quirky product with really interesting engagement metrics, but no one had the conviction to actually write us a check. Furthermore, like, our growth was happening on the other side of the world, right? And this is, I think, another big learning about venture capital, or at least what venture capital was before. Like, a lot of VCs want you to think quite globally, but the business of distributing and allocating capital is actually still incredibly local, right? So a lot of investors, they just didn't want to take a bet on something that was growing in like a market that they didn't understand and couldn't really help us out with. So a bunch of things happened, and we moved to India because we felt, this is where, yeah, this is where our community is. So we'll do it from here. And we had literally zero network, but we got very good at cold emailing and using like social media. So our like first, seed round led by Lightbox Ventures, it came through a cold email, right? I like read an article about Sandeep Murthy, who's the founder of the fund, in Forbes, like sitting in London, and I just thought he sounded like a really interesting guy, and he was saying some things that like really resonated with me. So guessed his email address and just sent him an email, and somehow like he replied within a few days. We got on a video call within like a few days after that. I was on a one-way flight to Mumbai, like straight from the airport, went to his office without a meeting scheduled. He was like little freaked out, like who does that? And yeah, 6 months later, we raised money. So that was pretty much like what brought us there. Now, I think what's kept me there has been just excitement and energy, right? I feel like it's just been a blast. We've had a lot of fun. I think it's just a very exciting place to build from, and I'm sure you must be feeling this as well. Like it's there's a lot of aspiration, there's a lot of ambition, there is a lot of talent, and it's a bit of a wild west. There's a lot of like chaos as well. I think that that's one of the things you get used to when living and building in India. There's always this sense of like underlying organized chaos, and it's like I think people either love that or hate it, right? And I kind of
Yeah.
love it. I really do. And I think this is where like there's a lot of personal reasons almost that come to mind as well. I've always like really connected with the country, even though I was like, moved to England when I was like 3 years old. Um, and I always felt somewhere deep down that at some point, like I'd go back and do something. I have no idea what or how or what the context would be, but that will happen. And it did. And yeah, we've just been continuing since then, and we built like an amazing, awesome team. Like feels like a family, and everyone's super, close and aligned and excited. So we've just built from there and continue to do so. So I think you mentioned about COVID and like pre-COVID and post-COVID and how we've kind of navigated that. So interestingly, even before COVID, I think in the like 3 to 6 months before, we were running remote experiments culturally. And this was because we found that like we were finding, it a challenge to hire like great data scientists and machine learning engineers in Mumbai. It's not necessarily a hub for AI, right?
Mhm.
And we felt we shouldn't be so strict about location because we're losing time, right? We're just like literally not accepting people because they can't move to the city. Doesn't really make sense anymore because you have Zoom, you have the internet, and I think if you have good internal processes, you can work from anywhere. So we'd already started those experiments, and then COVID happened, and obviously like accelerated the kind of whole world towards this digital shift and this new paradigm. And now we're in a place where, so during COVID, we actually let go of our office. It was a tough call because we built up like a lovely community event space, but unfortunately, it just didn't make any sense to support it through a pandemic. The landlord had jacked up the rent like a few months ago, so like it just couldn't continue. And we've taken the call that for now we'll just work remotely. So the majority of the team is still in India, but we have team members in literally Hong Kong and Canada, and yeah, and we've just figured out how to make it work for us. So
Fair point, fair point. But I love the approach again. Like somewhere down that answer, you mentioned that you have to be close to the community that you're building for, and I think like that goes to show a lot. Like in terms of how you thought about approaching the consumer and dealing with it. So great cue there again. Moving from there, let's say, okay, to a couple of really fascinating things about HaikuJAM that I stumbled upon during my research, and again all of this from a strategic viewpoint, so that let's say budding entrepreneurs like myself can take cues from it. So one of the great factors has been in terms of design, right? Like I love that, and I know very little of it, to be very honest, right? But that doesn't stop me from questioning you about it. So if you can perhaps tell us, what was the kind of thought that was given to design, to the visual appeal, to let's say the front end of the processes? How much of it was impacted by you as well would be interesting to understand, given that to understand how much of the founder's creativity actually boils down and inspires the product, and product thinking is something that I'm always in the lookout for. So if you could perhaps touch upon a couple of pointers there, it'd be a great understanding of product thinking, or building great applications and design thinking, if all of that makes sense.
yeah, sure. So I think one of the things that I've learned about building products, but also building teams, is that the worldviews and the principles and the philosophies of the individuals in that team will inevitably manifest inside of a product,
Mhm.
right? Which is why I think it's so important that you hire as diversely as you can, right? Because you don't just want like, a singular perspective, because that leads to very, very linear and boring and even dangerous experiences because just a lot of like nuance is missed. So I feel with Haiku Jam, just like the product is a truly collaborative effort, I feel it truly has been a collaborative effort. Not by no means just not just myself, but like a brilliant product team, brilliant design team that we've built up. And it's been an almost an amalgamation of like that collective worldview that we have. So what's interesting is that when we built it, we weren't necessarily thinking consciously about this, right? It's more that when we launched it, people would come and tell us that, wow, this is like a really beautifully designed product, right? I've been to Silicon Valley a few times on fundraising, and people were like shocked actually when they saw the product. That when they asked me like, where are you based? Where's your team based? I say we're based in Bombay, and they'd be like, what? Like, we thought you were guys in LA or something like that. And it's like, really? Okay, no. I mean, we're not. We're in India. And for whatever reason, like I don't think a lot of like Indian entrepreneurs have built successfully for the world as yet. Maybe because of course, like such a huge domestic market as well, that you don't necessarily even need to, and it's up to you what you want to do and who you're going after, and that's a very personal and decision for founders and businesses. But I think for us, it's we've kind of built something from the world from day zero, right? And if I look back to like that first experience in the tea shop, like my instinct, right, and my first idea wasn't, okay, I want to write now again with my best friend on an app or just like two people in my college. I thought, wouldn't it be amazing to send a line and a school teacher in South Korea picks it up,
Yeah.
right? And adds their thought and then sends it on to an artist in San Francisco. And, you know, there's no pressure for us to talk, to meet, to video call, nothing. But we will connect through a really, really beautiful, almost like unapologetically like fleeting moment, right?
Mhm.
Um, and that was it. So, like, thinking about it, it's not a surprise that like we designed a pretty culturally neutral product. In fact, culturally neutral is a horrible word. I apologize. Like it's not. I don't think anything should be like neutral of culture, but something that was just like easily understood and easy to like and felt intuitive to like people all around the world. So and then on top of that, we like shout out to Nu, who is our lead designer at HaikuJAM. The guy's like a genius, and he always like he'll always bring like wireframes and thoughts just to life. And without him, we wouldn't have been able to do a lot of this. But and also just a brilliant product team, like super empathetic, humble, always listening to community and listening to ourselves as well. So yeah, as with most things, it's never really I don't think it's ever like one person or one idea. It's always like a collective of people working towards something. Um, and I think one of the things we've always insisted on is like going the extra mile with product as well. Like there's a lot of things that you don't necessarily have to do, right? Like the market isn't demanding of this particular feature or mechanic or aesthetic. But I think that you should always treat your work like art, and you should always see yourself as an artist no matter like what you're doing or who you are. So we do take a lot of pride when we build and when we put something out. Don't always get it right, and there's a lot of stuff in the app that could still be a lot better, including in Inspo. There's a lot of stuff that feels like really clunky and and needs a lot of work. But I think products are just never finished, right? You've just got to keep committing yourself to a direction and a path and ensuring that like we're just going to make it better and better and better. So yeah, hope that answers your question.
It does. I love that thought. I mean, that's a very fresh perspective to, I don't know, thinking about founders, because I've heard, founders talk about themselves in a lot of contexts, and artists as well. But looking at work as art, and the way you described it was spectacular. And I must say that, with a very neutral perspective, I do come from admiration for the product because I love it. And that's where like this question was naturally out of curiosity. And I would say that, my next question is also a segue from there, because there are so many things I love about the product, in the sense that, that there's this map that comes up, right? Like how many kilometers did your jam go about. There's this insane community about it, right? Like almost all the time your like my lines will get completed within an hour or two of me writing it, and it'll go to so many different places, right? So I want to talk a bit about community there. Also, side note, it almost slipped my mind, but it's wonderful to hear from you, how you kept that global mentality from day zero. And again, that's a great viewpoint for everybody to actually remember, because as youngsters, if we can internalize that concept better and be very particular about it from our starting out journey, I think it'll be very helpful. And I think the podcast stands for that theme as well. I'll take a moment here to give that a shout out as well, because I named it Indian Silicon Valley with the very motive that I strongly believe that the next wave of global companies will come from India. So that was basically a side note, but would love your opinion on so everybody talks about community, and that's the buzzword that goes about it, but I'm not very sure how many people, with all due respect again, right, practice it at the essence of their product and actually base the core of their product around community. So would love your thoughts on what's the right way, like how did you go about it for starters in HaikuJAM, and if you have any general principles for community building for early stage entrepreneurs, because that can be a great way for early adoption, for growth, for making the product viral and things like that, right? So would love your viewpoint there.
So I feel that if you are engaging in community building for growth and for growth purposes, you should just stop right there and not do it, right?
Fair.
Because I feel that there's a lot of things that you should do for growth. Community building is not one of them,
For
right?
sure.
And it is in the longer run. I feel like it's almost a byproduct.
Yeah.
Growth, it's inevitable if community building is done well, but I don't think you can do community building with that intention. I think you have to do
For
it
sure.
a kind of purer intention than that.
Right.
And that often means you've got to ask yourself, like, what does your community want? Not what do you want, right? Like, there's
Fair.
always, one of the classic product challenges is that, people want their product to go viral or to be shared, right? So they'll plaster their product with tons of call to actions, right? And every single kind of like growth hacky opportunity just to get people to spread it to a friend. Um, but the fundamental question is that, does someone actually want to share it at that
Right.
moment in time, right? And largely no. Oftentimes the answer is like not really, right? So I think if it's just not done empathetically or natively, it's never really going to work. And community is something that you got to do because it's joyful and it's a wonderful, it's just a super meaningful initiative. Like for us, again, by the way, I wouldn't say I'm any expert on community building. Don't have enough experience of doing it like multiple times. I think HaikuJam has been the core experience, and I'd say we did that pretty well without even again calling it community building. It's funny, like I feel
Right.
we've been as a team, we've always been like ahead of a few sort of like meta trends that like manifest later. We don't label them as anything, and but we were doing them like a few years before, like in a in quite a serious way. So for instance, like for us, community building meant right, not just the features inside the app and bringing a sense of like closeness and magic, although that was a big part of it. That to us that was product, right, and giving a sense of like shared digital space, which was great, and that was a good thing to do. But for us, we realized that look, HaikuJam's origins were offline, right, in a tea shop, happening on pieces of paper, um, and that was a really enjoyable and lovely experience, right? And if you are in a room with someone, you don't need to be on your phone to engage in that. It's just great to be in the room and be present, right? Enjoying a cup of chai and like writing with someone. It's a really really unique experience. So we said, let's forget about the app for a second, and we'll run these events, right? So like literally, and that's how like a bunch of our early growth came. We would go to cafes or anyone who would host us, whether it was like a school, a high school, all the way to like the European Parliament. We did a HaikuJam session there at the European Union. Google, IBM, eventually these companies like reached out for like live sessions. But all of this began in like, really super, super like just on the ground Um, and then we eventually figured out like how can we actually scale the model because people were reaching out from all around the world. Like we had jammers in 144 countries, and we obviously like can't be everywhere, and we wanted people to have that experience. So we created something called the Jam Ambassadors program, where anyone in the community could become a Jambassador, like apply and go through a few steps, and then yeah, you will run Haiku Jam sessions in your local area, right? We'd send you a big box of Haiku Jam cards, stickers, pens, and then it was on you, right? And that became like a thing. It became a really fun card game that people played in workplaces, in schools at lunchtimes, at breaks. It was great. Um, and yeah, and as I mentioned about the office that we had, like the ground floor was basically an event space where we did like almost an event every single night, either ourselves or up through a partnering organization. So every Wednesday was like a stand-up comedy night where comedians around the city, around the country actually would come, and they riff with the audience and also like write with the audience as well. We did events with rappers, mental health professionals, like chefs around, different tasting experiences and writing about them. So many, I mean, like hundreds. And all of that, like, what was interesting about those events is like they didn't lead to explosive growth, right?
Right.
And to be very honest, as a founding team, we'd often have those discussions as well, like, should we be doing these? Right? Like, if you look at the metrics, like, should we be really doing them? Because we got, like, let's say 10 new jammers from that event that we did for 100 people. Um, and then, of course, you have investors, and they will, of course, have these questions like, why are you doing what you're doing?
Right.
Um, and in fact, I think the event that you were talking about, where you were in the audience, and when I came to your college like a few years ago, I think that was part of like an event tour where I was going around different cities, just like either giving talks or running live haiku jam sessions,
Right.
right? Um, and this is where like there's that famous saying I think from Paul Graham that you should do the things that don't scale.
Right.
Because they're just the right things to do. And I think that's what made Haiku Jam a really special experience for people. People I think realize that this isn't just a transactional space, right? Where we can all become like professional writers or monetize. It was meaningful. And it was because we did things that, didn't necessarily make like sort of business sense, but really cultivated a sense of intimacy between strangers. And that's really what it was all about. Now, if I could go back and do it differently, to some degree, I would. I think there's again a lot of ways we could have made it more efficient, a little bit more scalable. But again, that's all tactical stuff. I think the essence of it is unchanged, and we're taking that same essence into Inspo, right? So I think I feel like people. It's dangerous to take things like community building and make them too prescriptive, right? Because again, I'm sure there are a lot of like best practices, but community building isn't just like a Zoom call with your customers or like adding some kind of bulletin board to your product. It's not that. You got to figure out what it actually means for you.
Right.
For us, it meant something physical. It wasn't just like a digital edition. Um, and what was really interesting actually is that those two experiences were kind of like almost symbiotic. Like we realized that there was so much we learned from the in-person physical experience that went into product, right? So some of the most enjoyable conversations, at least for me, with the product team, was around how like there is a magic to going up to a stranger, looking in his or her eyes, and giving them a Haiku Jam card, right? You don't know who they are, you don't know their name, but you've written a line and you're like, hey, I'd love for you to write the next line. And they're always a little bit taken aback by that. They're like, right? Like, what is happening? And then they write the like next line and they'll pass it on to someone else. And these people like do not know each other, but there is a sense of like there's a real bond, right? There's a real sense of almost like a strange creative kinship that's taking place. Um, so we took that experience and had like super uh, kind of like intricate product discussions around it. Like, okay, when you publish a line and write a line in the app, how does and you receive a new jam from someone else. how can it feel like a stranger giving you a piece of card, right? Whether it's through UI or micro animation or design or copy, like how can we recreate that experience? Obviously, you can't perfectly, um, but there are ways you can do it to make it feel magical and intimate. And then you mentioned the haiku maps as well, which
Right.
showed literally visualized, and that was an idea from one of my co-founders. And again, that was almost like the opposite side of the problem, where there are things that you can do digitally that you can't do in the physical world, right? Like to write with a stranger in Korea and an artist in San Francisco, that's just
No.
really inefficient. You have to post a card back and forth, and no one's going to do that. But you can digitally within seconds. Now, how do we create a sense of like belonging and wonder between those three people? And the answer was that, let's visualize it on a beautiful map to show like how far your lines have traveled, right? To make you realize that, wow, your thought has traveled 10,000 miles, right? And yeah, I think that's there was always a fun story around the metrics that we decided to show people
Mhm.
in the app. So I think honestly, high level point is just figure out what you're doing fundamentally. Don't just copy like other models. Don't just see that, okay, just because other apps have like buttons in them or number of followers, that's the model or nomenclature for you. You should really figure out what are we actually trying to do here and why are we trying to do that. And if you go deep enough into those questions, you will come out with like very unique answers. And again, and that helps you build a brand, a community, and then and a sense of defensibility as well. Like people love to talk about moats,
Right.
right? I think that's the best way you can really build something unique and just by just differentiating yourself from first principles. And yeah, people will struggle to copy you.
Yeah, yeah. I think I read somewhere, it said that you are the moat. And that's such a powerful line if we can perhaps internalize it. But I love that thought again. And I think, like the way I put it across as well, in hindsight, I recall that it was just a bad way of putting it. It like, you can say that go out there and network. And I think Reid Hoffman put it, that's such a bullshit or, like, pardon my language, but that's such a bad way of putting it because there's nothing like you can't go and let's say network. That's you just have to be good generally, and you just have to have that within you. You either do or you don't. And it's great to see how naturally it came to you. Again, I think the cue for me there is also, you have to know yourself the best and know what your product stands for, and perhaps go out there and build it, right? And you use the amazing phrase, do things that don't scale. Great pointers again, Thrupad. Like, I must commend that. And this might be a good time to, let's say, enter into one of the last segments. Like, here in the last 10 minutes, I just want to talk about more, let's say, about you as a founder, you as a person, and what gets you going. Because I think those are again like great pointers to learn from. None of which is prescribing, of course. Like, I'm sure each one of us deserves to go out there and find their own identity, but it'll be great to learn from your experiences, right? So my first question out there, right, is what do you like? This is in terms of belief systems, and I've quoted Vinod Khosla enough times to quote him again. But what I essentially want to ask you is that what do you stand for, right? What are some of the things that truly get you going, or what are some of the things that get you where you are or get you moving forward? If you can perhaps ponder upon that, because I know for a fact that in a couple of previous podcast interviews you mentioned that you really want to add value, impact, discipline. You're either all in or not, and you mentioned some really good things. You're creative by nature, you read a lot, and you post a lot of things. You're building in public to an extent, and there's so many things about you that are so fascinating, right? So it'd be great to get a cue about how is it that you've built that persona around you. What is it? What is the secret sauce, if I might add spice to it and frame it? But would love to hear some of that.
Wow, I really wish there was a secret sauce because it would make life a lot easier if I knew what it was. And I feel like I've still got a very long way to go as well. Like there's
For
still
sure.
a lot of challenges on the road ahead, right? Um, Honestly, I think comes back to what we were talking about at the very start of the conversation. I feel like you should do things that are really meaningful for you. So I know for me personally, like I love working on innately creative ideas, right? I'm not particularly interested in, let's say, copycat models or just spotting a market opportunity and plugging the gap, right? And there's no judgment here at all, by the way. I think ideation and figuring out like your process is a really, really personal thing. But I know I have, founder friends who don't care too much about the industry, don't care too much about like the specifics of the opportunity. They just spot like, okay, there's 100 million supply side opportunity there, right? And they get a kick from solving that problem, right? So I'd say they're like hardcore like solvers, almost like a void of context. Doesn't really matter what the problem is, as long as it's a problem. I'm happy to like channel all of my energies and go after solving that problem, and that's what I love to do. And I just know that I'm not in that category of person. Like for me, the specific context like matters a lot, and I love yeah, I love doing things that maybe haven't been done before. Um, I love building and thinking at the intersection of creativity and technology. I think HaikuJAM was definitely at that intersection. Inspo is absolutely at that intersection. And yeah, and working super hard at like manifesting those kind of ideas. And it's even more difficult, I feel, because not only do you have product and technology challenges, but you have big communication challenges as well, right? I think even for like a product like Inspo, I think half our battle will be communication,
Right.
right? Because the product is great, like the product works wonders, and it's been working wonders for like big brands and creatives in private beta. But to work those wonders, it takes a while to like people understand like what you mean, because even the word inspiration, right? I think a lot of people are quite skeptical about it. It's just like it's quite difficult to define, right? It's quite people don't really know what it is. They don't know if you can consciously design for it. It's something that feels like just divined, comes from the sky somewhere, right? Like when you're sitting under a tree or something like that. Um, so even that word and the associations around that word are a challenge. To the point, even just before this call, actually, I was chatting with a friend who was asking me, like, it sounds great, but I think you shouldn't really talk about inspiration. I think that's too hard, right? It's too hard to sell that. You should talk about, you should words like insights or ideas more, or like content, right? And I said, well, if that's what it was, right? If it was an insights engine, then sure, we would, but it's not, right? There are a lot of insights within the platform, but inspiration is what we are world class at, right? Like we are the world's best at it, right? Or at least we could be. That's what we are going 10 levels deep on. Um, and I don't know if we're going to be super, super successful commercially. I feel that we strongly could be. I believe the opportunity is there. But what I do know is that as a team, we'll go deeper than anyone else, right? And the journey will be mind bending. It will be crazy, and we'll emerge with something. And I feel I've always had that like sense of comfort that with the unknown. I think some people like to really, really hyper, almost like plan and map things out, either not just in their businesses but also in their lives. And I've been comfortable with the level of uncertainty. I'm comfortable with the fact that like, okay, we're a very strong team. We're a very aligned team. Things will probably change. The product may go in a slightly different direction. There'll be a bunch of things that come up along the way, but we will figure it out, and we'll go down this rabbit hole, and we'll emerge with something really, really valuable and good for the world. So um, yeah, and I try and keep it as simple as I can. I find that when I am like performing the worst, it's when I'm overthinking things, right? Or trying to like be too strategic or tactical. And I feel like you should always try and just evoke the essence of what you're actually working on and building, and not worry too much about what other people are doing, because that can be a huge distraction as well.
Brilliant again. Like I'm almost at a loss of words, to be very honest, because again I just feel there's so many core components, the tiny bits that matter that you've mentioned in part, that are going to be very, very useful, right? Like I really believe that, and I really hope that Inspo does do tremendously well. We all do, I'm sure. I have just two more questions, and I wouldn't, stretch it a lot. But one thing that I've really found, again, inspirational, if I may, about your journey is the kind of belief and aspiration you've had at each instance, right? Because I just feel so, having done research about you, you wrote a letter early on to the prime minister of your country, if I'm not wrong. There's a story about that. You started a newspaper at the age of 14, and there's so many things, right? And maybe, like, when I was thinking about this, and I'm being very candid here, I felt like maybe times were simpler then, right? You, as a child, when you're not aware about too many things, maybe life is simpler. But what I've observed as a pattern is that you have immense self conviction, great belief, and aspiration. And I feel a lot of that is, if not lacking, a lot of the realization of it is to an extent lacking and hold some people back, right? To make that plunge, to take that leap of faith, right? So, again, since we're talking about the larger concepts of starting up and your journey, I'd love your thought on this, and perhaps, probably not overcome it. I understand it's a very personal journey for everybody, but how do you perhaps, build that over time, or what's your theory there?
Wow, that's another really big question. I feel so. Firstly, there's definitely no theory because I got to think about it a lot more for even to even attempt a theory. Um, I feel that people are like infinite pools of potential, and most people don't see that, right? I don't think people realize what they're truly capable of. I think people are always, you know, they underrate themselves a lot. And I feel some of the kind of early experiences in my life were like really formative ones that sent me down a particular path, not just professionally, but in terms of like philosophically as well. So, for instance, I credit a lot to that very first tiny startup experience in high school. I was like 14 and set up a newspaper, right? A local newspaper based on positive journalism with some friends. And I think why that was such an incredibly empowering experience was that you realize that you could actually make something, right? We were like kids um, and bouncing around ideas in a classroom. And then in like 3 to 6 months' time, those ideas had like manifested and, people were actually enjoying them and they'd been productized and there were like customers and readers and local advertisers. And that's today still blows my mind, right? Even like, and I think that's one of the most enjoyable thing about creating or entrepreneurship, if we call it that. It's the fact that you're still ultimately just sat in a room with a couple of friends trying to figure something out, and you know that you have the skills and the ability and the what's the right word, the tenacity to go and realize those dreams or thoughts or ideas. So I think, and then it just becomes a case of like almost like building, training any muscle. Once you've done it once, you get better at it over time. And I've still got a lot to get better at as well. There's still a lot around like, scaling business models that I haven't successfully done. I don't think, and that's the next like phase of my personal journey and the journey for the team as well. Um, but yeah, I think a lot of people underrate themselves. They so I was having this random loose thought last night about like there are kind of two flywheels in the world, two personal flywheels. The first flywheel, and I think this is the one that most people are on and kind of suffer from, is that as you age and get older, your thinking becomes smaller, right? And there's and the second flywheel is that as you age and you get older, your thinking becomes bigger. And I'd say 99.999% of the world is trapped within that first flywheel, where as you get older, you start to really swear by this word compromise, right, and settling, right, and I like, maybe because I'm also like growing up now, like it terrifies me, less like compromising, settling, but I think it's a really unhealthy way of looking at things, right, where people think they've got such a short, narrow window to become successful. And then after that, you're going to get married, you're going to buy a house, you're going to have kids, and nothing is possible at that point in time. I think it creates enormous amounts of really unhealthy pressure, and doesn't really reflect the way the world is at all. It's just a really unhealthy narrative that like society has uh, force fed us since we were young. Um, and I think if you can just redesign, figure out a way to redesign that narrative for yourself and realize that, look, you can do anything, right? You can literally do anything that you want. And it doesn't need to be a quote unquote big thing, right? You don't need to go and set up $1 billion company. I don't think there's anything that noble about going and setting up like a massive company, right? Even though that's what a lot of people aspire to and kind of like um heroify, and there's just, you should just figure out like what it is that you want to do, and then like garner your resources and your skills, and focus all your attention and your energy on getting that done. Um and yeah, it's obviously like it's very easy to say, it's a lot harder to do, but fundamentally that's all it comes down to, right? Like there's something in your head that you feel would be great for a bunch of other people. And it's about just figuring out how do you get it out of your head and actually like turn it into something, and that's pretty much what any business or product or piece of art or novel is. So yeah, again, I don't really know what you asked me or if this is what you were looking for, but these are kind of my thoughts on it.
I love again that the stream of thought goes to show that like even if like as you said, like some of those things came naturally to you due to the series of events that led to where you are, but the fact that you're still willing to like you're so cognizant of your limitations, and you're still believing in the fact that there is so much to be done and you're still working towards it, speaks volumes of how we can take cues of it, because I'm sure circumstances are going to differ. But again, as they say, like it's the best time to start and not start up was yesterday, and the second best is now. So whatever you're choosing to do, like it could or could not be starting up a company, but whatever's holding you back, like if you didn't do it yesterday, like do it now, I guess. Like I think large part of what I took back from that was that. But I love how we ventured into so many I think existential thoughts, which will be very important to I think understand as well, because I really feel, I think Kunal Shah puts it very well, right? You have to be able to understand people to become a very good founder, right? Like I think that's a beautiful thought. So this has been wonderful, Dhrupad, and
Just, sorry to interrupt you, just to close on that, because I think that is a beautiful thought, and I think it perfectly um, aligns with my like deep belief as well, and that is that I'm first and foremost really excited by people, right? And I always struggle to use this word like technologist, because technically I am, like, I'm working in that sector, and building some interesting things. Um, but it's never been a deep interest at all. I think there are a lot better technologists out there. But I've always been interested in bringing people together, and doing interesting things with people and unlocking creativity within people. And I think that's yeah, I mean, that's a powerful thought, and Kunal put it beautifully. So yeah, I thought I just mentioned that, it came to mind.
No, for sure. And I was just, I don't think like I do like I almost am fallen short of words, to conclude the episode. But as we end, right, I mostly ask a very generic, stereotypical end. But since we've spoken about so many abstract things, I'd probably try an abstract end here as well. What are the difficult, things for a founder is also to gain inspiration, right? Because the founder journey is again very very lonely. There's so many pitfalls, you're struggling with so much, and I'm sure the team is behind you, but there's so many thoughts that are so personal to you because it's like your baby, right? So what I'm now trying to eye at is that given that you're creating a product which is inspiration led, what's the secret? Again, like secret is a bad way to put it, but where do you as a founder and as a person derive your inspiration for, right? Like it could be, again, if I were to look at this deeply, I could perhaps end up thinking that where does Drupad think, or where does he get his inspiration for, because he's building so much for the world, but what is he doing for himself? So I think that'd be a great way to end the episode, and thank you so much for a bunch of amazing ideas here. So awaiting this again, great line of answer, which I'm sure it will be.
I'm not sure about that, but it's a question I feel like almost super unprepared for, and I really should be prepared for it because, like you said, you're building an inspiration partner, right? So surely you should be super cognizant of your own inspiration. But I think what I'd say is, for me personally, like again, super inspired by people, and both fictional and non-fictional, right? So I love to write fiction and read a lot of fiction. That's my like just interest. And for me, it's not just about like entertainment, right, or passing the time. Like I feel that it fiction really cultivates a sense of empathy. um, so I do draw a lot of like subconscious inspiration from like the books that I'm reading, and the characters I'm choosing to like uh, you know witness for a period of time. A very close friend of mine puts it super beautifully. She says that for her, fiction is a time commitment to empathy, right? Because when you watch a movie or like you watch a Netflix show, you're committing to that story and that universe for like a couple of hours, right? And that's great. That's an important experience. But when you pick up like let's say a novel, you're committing to that world for like potentially a week, a month, or if you're reading something like Shantaram, like a year, right? Because it's a long book. um, and I feel like that commitment to empathy is really um, it teaches you a lot about the world. We're not talking just like, you know, um, inspiration to build companies here. I think it's much bigger than that. It's inspiration like how to almost be a human and how to like live. Because I think living isn't easy, right? I think there's a lot of like it's a complex world. It's growing like more complex by the second. Any way where you can find a way to distill it and like find your inner essence is great. So yeah, people, and then I'm a like I'd say other big sources like my meditation practice. That helps a lot. I feel I'd be like quite lost without that as well. So yeah, any form of internal inquiry I think is good, because it helps you realize that like all the you know answers are within you, and you yourself are a wellspring of inspiration. And I don't mean that in an egotistic sense at all. Like you are, there's a lot within all of us, um, and you just need the kind of creative confidence to like evoke it. So and if we can do that, then yeah, the world's just a much happier and more inspired place.
For sure. So looking deep within and people, I think that again, I couldn't think of a better way to end the episode. This has been truly wonderful. Like I think the 3.5 year wait and a 6 month wait was definitely worth it. And I'm sure it's going to be for everybody else as well. I truly am saying this. This was an absolute treat, and I'm sure this is going to be very beneficial for everybody who's listening. So thank you so much for your time, Drupal.
Thank you so much, Devraj, and congrats. It's been amazing watching you build out the podcast, and I think you run it beautifully as well. So thanks so much for having me.